My ungrateful grandson Leo always saw me as a burden and my memories as junk. He started by stealing small things, a silver picture frame, $20 from my prescription jar. Then one day, he stole the big thing. He took my worthless old car from the garage, the one my late husband and I built with our own hands, and sold it to a junkyard for $500. He laughed when he told me he'd done me a favor by clearing out the junk. A week later, the police showed up with a man from the National Auto Museum. They called the car a priceless national treasure. They called what Leo did Grand Theft Auto. I started my morning routine at the kitchen sink. The hot water ran over my stiff knuckles. My house was always quiet except when Leo was here. "This place is a dump, Grandma," he said, his voice muffled. I turned. Leo, my grandson, just 20 years old, was leaning against my counter. He had his phone in one hand and my last muffin in the other. Crumbs dotted his gray hoodie. He did not look up from the bright screen. "All this old junk," he muttered. He kicked a leg of the small wooden table. "That junk is my life, Leo," I said. I dried my hands on the towel, the fabric worn thin. "It's rude to talk about a person's home that way." He just shrugged and took another large bite. I sighed and walked into the living room. The quiet in here felt different. It was hollow. I stopped at the mantelpiece. The afternoon sun hit the wood, showing a small, clean rectangle of dust where the silver frame used to be. My wedding photo, Arthur and me, 1968. I went to my bedroom. The prescription jar on my dresser was open. I always kept $60 inside for the pharmacy delivery, tucked under the cotton balls. I counted the bills. 2 20s. One was gone. I walked back to the kitchen. The muffin was gone. Leo was wiping his fingers on his jeans. "Leo," I said, my voice steady. "Have you seen my silver picture frame?" He scoffed, finally looking up. "What, the old one? You probably lost it. You're losing everything these days, Grandma." My jaw tightened. "And the money from my prescription jar?" He had the nerve to look offended. "Are you accusing me of something?" He pushed off the counter. "I'm not the one who's forgetful." He jangled a set of keys in his hand. "My keys? Where are you going?" I asked. "You said you'd help me clean the gutters." Change of plans. "Gotta run an errand," he said. He was already moving toward the back door. "Leo, I need my car for my appointment on Friday." Yeah, I'll bring it back." He waved a hand over his shoulder, not even looking at me. "I'm doing you a favor, keeping the battery from dying." The screen door slammed shut. I heard the sputter and cough of my 10-year-old sedan, then the sound of tires on the gravel driveway, leaving too fast. I stood in the silence of my kitchen. The only sound was the drip of the faucet I hadn't turned off tightly enough. He saw me as a burden, a forgetful old woman surrounded by junk. The rest of the day was quiet. Too quiet. I sorted the mail. I wiped down the dusty spot on the mantel. I thought about calling the police about the frame, about the money. But what would I say? It was his word against mine, and he was my daughter's only son. Late that afternoon, when the sun was low and orange, I went to the one place he never bothered with. The garage smelled of motor oil, old wood, and time. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light coming from the dirty window. It was cluttered. Arthur had never thrown anything away. Old tires were stacked in the corner. Jars of screws and bolts lined the shelves, and in the center, under a heavy canvas tarp, was the reason. My hands were stiff, but I grabbed the edge of the tarp. It was heavy, weighted with years of dust. I pulled, and the canvas slid, falling to the concrete floor with a heavy whump. There it was. The Ethereum. It was not like other cars. It was long and low, and the metal, a dull, unpolished aluminum, was shaped in smooth, flowing lines. Arthur had been obsessed with aerospace. He wanted it to look like it was moving, even when it was standing still. He built it in 1969, the year we watched the men walk on the moon. I ran my hand over the cold metal of the rear fin. My fingers traced the curve, feeling the tiny imperfections where Arthur and I had smoothed the bodywork by hand. I leaned close. I pressed my cheek against the glass of the driver's side window, and I breathed in. It smelled like him. Faint, but it was there. Oil, leather, and just a trace of the cologne he always wore. I closed my eyes. I could almost hear his voice bouncing off the garage walls, full of excitement. They said it couldn't be done, Ilara. Not in a garage. But we did it. You and me. We did it. This car was not junk. It was not a car, not really. It was my last promise. It was the physical proof of our shared dream. It was the last, tangible piece of Arthur I had left in the world. I found a soft rag on the workbench and began to wipe the dust from the hood. I had to protect it. I was the only one left who knew what it really was. On Friday, my neighbor, Mrs. Petrov, had to drive me to my doctor's appointment. Leo never brought my car back. Her sedan was too high, and my knees ached as I climbed out. "Thank you, dear," I said, leaning on my cane. "Any time, Ilara." "Are you sure he's not just at a friend's?" she asked. "I'm sure," I said. She drove off, and I stood on my walkway. Something was wrong. The air felt too still. Then I saw it. The large roll-up door to my garage, the one that was always stuck, was open. Wide open, pulled all the way up. A cold breeze moved from it, carrying the smell of oil and dust out into the yard. I gripped my cane. I walked faster than I had in years. "No," I whispered. "No, no." I got to the doorway and stopped. The heavy canvas tarp was crumpled in a corner, like a discarded skin. The space where the Etherean had sat for 40 years was empty. All that was left was a dark, rectangular stain on the concrete, a shadow of oil and time. The shelves of bolts were there. The stacked tires were there. But the car, our car, was gone. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. A cold, heavy certainty settled in my stomach. I knew who had done this. I turned, walked back into my house, and sat in my living room chair, and I waited. The sun went down. The house grew dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat, listening to the clock tick. I must have fallen asleep, because a noise startled me awake. It was the sound of the back door opening and slamming shut. "Grandma, you in here? Why is it so dark?" Leo's voice. I heard him flick the light switch in the kitchen, then the one in the living room. The sudden brightness made me blink. He stood in the archway, backlit. He had a swagger in his step. He was wearing a new dark blue jacket I didn't recognize. He glanced at his wrist, admiring something. "A new, shiny smartwatch, Leo," I said. My voice was hoarse. "Whoa, you scared me. Sitting in the dark like a ghost." He laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "The car, Leo." I kept my voice flat. "The one in the garage." "Where is it?" His face changed. The fake smile dropped, replaced by that familiar, impatient annoyance. "Oh, that?" He actually laughed. "I finally did you the favor you were too senile to do yourself." I got rid of it. My breath caught. I gripped the arms of the chair. "Got rid of it?" "Yeah. Sold it to a junkyard." He pulled his phone out, then seemed to think better of it and slid it back into his pocket. "Can you believe it? The guy actually gave me $500 for that pile of rust." He dug into the pocket of his jeans. He pulled out a crumpled $100 bill and walked over. He tossed it onto the coffee table in front of me. It landed with a soft, insulting "Here," he said, his voice full of smugness. "My treat. I cleared out your junk for you." "You should be thanking me." I didn't look at the money. I just looked at his face, the face of my grandson. He saw no value in my life, in my memories. He saw no value in Arthur. He waited for me to say something, maybe to thank him. When I didn't, he shrugged. "Whatever," he said. "I'm going out." "Don't wait up!" The back door slammed again. I was alone in the bright, empty room. The only sound was the clock ticking. I stared at the $100 bill on the table. It was the price of my husband's dream. The house was too quiet. The $100 bill on the coffee table was a green smear in my vision. I sat there until my back ached and my feet went numb. I thought of Leo's laugh. I did you a favor, I stood up. The shock was gone, and something else was in its place. It was cold and sharp. I needed to see. I needed to know what he had done. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. My hand trembled as I held the glass, and I saw it. On the counter, next to the breadcrumbs from my muffin, was a greasy white and yellow piece of paper. A receipt. Leo was careless. He was arrogant. He hadn't even bothered to hide it. Sarge's scrap and metal, the header said. Cash for junk. Below it, a line. 1X vintage auto body, 500 zars, and an address on the industrial side of town. I put down the glass of water. I went to my room, took off my housecoat, and put on my good wool coat, the gray one. I put my wallet in my purse. I found my cane. I walked back through the living room, past the $100 bill. I did not take it. I locked the front door behind me and called a taxi from the phone on my porch. The taxi driver, a young man, looked at me, then at the address, then back at me. "You sure, lady?" he asked. This is the scrapyard." "I am sure," I said, my voice thin. The drive was 20 minutes. We went past the highway, over the train tracks, and into the part of town where the factories were. The air here smelled different. It smelled like metal and wet dirt. He pulled up to a high chain-link fence, topped with wire. A painted sign, faded and peeling, read, "Sarge's Scrap and Metal." Beyond the fence, I could see mountains of twisted-up cars. "You want me to wait?" the driver asked. "Yes, please." I got out. My cane sank a little into the gravel. I walked toward a small one-story building with a greasy window and a sign that said, "Office." Before I could get there, a man came out, wiping his hands on a red rag. He was big, with a graying beard and a face full of deep lines. He wore dark blue overalls, stained black with grease. "This must be Sarge. Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was rough. I'm here about a car," I said. "My grandson sold it to you. Yesterday, Leo Vance." His eyes narrowed. He stopped wiping his hands. "Yeah, what about it?" "It was mine. He stole it from me. He didn't have permission. I wanted to see it." My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated it. He looked at me for a long time. He saw my gray coat, my cane, the lines on my own face. He seemed to measure my words. "The kid said it was his," Sarge said. "Said it was junk." Looked like a smart-mouth kid to me. "I only gave him $500. "He was wrong," I whispered. Sarge's expression hardened, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, at the gate. He was angry at Leo. "Yeah," he said, stuffing the rag in his back pocket. I'm starting to think he was. "Come on," he turned. "I'll show you. It's in the back. I was just looking at it." He led me past the office, away from the huge magnet lifting a crushed car, away from the sound of grinding metal. We went to a quieter area, under a long tin roof, where they kept cars that might have parts worth saving, and there it was. It was parked between a wrecked pickup truck and a stack of tires. It was covered in dust from the drive, but it was whole. It was safe. I moved away from Sarge, walking toward it. My hand went out, and I touched the cold aluminum fin. "Arthur," I whispered. "It just came out. Arthur?" Sarge's rough voice was softer now. "My husband," I said, not turning. "My late husband. We built it, together, in our garage." I heard him step closer. I heard him talking to another mechanic, a younger man. "Gary, I told you," Sarge said. "This ain't no Chevy." He turned back to me. "Ma'am, you said your husband was Arthur Vance?" "Yes." I finally looked at him. Sarge stared at the car, then at me. He reached into the pocket of his overalls. He pulled out a small, dark, rectangular object. He rubbed the grime off it with his thumb. It was a small metal plaque. He didn't happen to call this thing, Sarge read, squinting, the Etherian prototype 001, did he? I stared at the plaque in his dirty hand. Arthur had screwed that to the dashboard himself. I had polished it every year. Yes, I said. Yes, that's it. You found it. Sarge looked from the plaque to the car to my face. The confusion was gone. His face was now a mix of shock and pure, cold anger. That kid, he spat. That lying. He stops himself. Ma'am, you need to call the police. I was too stunned to speak. No, Sarge said, shaking his head. I'll do it. I already called a friend of mine, a guy who knows cars, 'cause I knew this was something. But this is grand theft. And that thing ain't no $500 pile of junk. He held the plaque out, as if showing me proof of my own life. A complete stranger, in a place filled with broken things, understood. He knew. It had been a strange, quiet week. After my visit to Sarge's scrap and metal, things had happened quickly. The police met me back at my house. I gave them the greasy receipt with Leo's name on it. I told them what he had said. I told them he had stolen my house keys to get into the garage. Sarge had the Etherian towed to a secure police impound lot, so it was safe from being cut up or sold. I had to sign a form, identifying myself as the owner. My hand, I remember, was perfectly steady when I signed Alara Vance. I hadn't seen Leo. He hadn't come back for clothes. He hadn't called. The $100 bill was still on the coffee table, a green stain on the wood. I just left it there. I was waiting. I knew he would be back when he ran out of money. I was in the kitchen, washing my mug, when I heard the cars. It wasn't one car. It was two. I turned, my hands still wet, and looked out the window over the sink. A marked police car was parked at my curb. Behind it, a sleek black sedan had just pulled up. It was spotless and looked expensive. My heart didn't pound. I just felt cold. I dried my hands slowly on the dish towel. The doorbell rang, a polite two-note chime. I walked to the front door, my cane tapping on the hardwood floor. I looked through the peephole. Two uniformed police officers stood on my porch. One was the young officer who had taken my report. Beside them stood a third man. He was not a police officer. He was older, thin, and wore a gray suit with a crisp white shirt. He had wire-rimmed glasses and was holding a leather briefcase. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. Mrs. Alara Vance? The man in the suit asked. His voice was soft and precise. Yes, I am. My name is Dr. Evans. I'm with the National Auto Museum. He held out a thin business card. May we come in for a moment? We're here about your car. I stepped back and held the door open. Please. The two officers stayed in the entryway, their hands on their belts. Dr. Evans, however, stepped into my living room. He stopped and looked around at my old furniture, at the photographs on the wall. His eyes briefly settled on the $100 bill on the coffee table. He did not comment. Please, have a seat, I said, gesturing to the armchair. Thank you, he said. Mrs. Vance, we received a call from the police. They were processing a very unique vehicle, a vehicle that was first reported by a Mr. Sarge at a local junkyard. Yes, I said. He was very kind. Dr. Evans leaned forward slightly. He was more than kind, Mrs. Vance. He was observant. He believes he has or had your husband's Etherian prototype. He did, I said. My voice was quiet. It was my husband's and mine. My grandson, Leo, he stole it. He sold it to Mr. Sarge for junk. The officer in the hall, the younger one, spoke up. Ma'am, just for our report, do you have any idea of the value of that vehicle? I looked at the officer, then at Dr. Evans. I thought of Leo's new watch and his smug laugh. To me, I said, it was priceless. It was my husband's life's work. To my grandson, it was $500. Dr. Evans adjusted his glasses. He looked at me with a serious, almost sad expression. Mrs. Vance, he began, The Ethereum is not junk. It is the only one of its kind. We, the automotive world, we thought it was a myth, or that it had been destroyed decades ago. It's a revolutionary concept car, the first to use certain techniques. It has been lost for 40 years. I just stared at him. I knew it was special. Arthur had always said so. But I didn't know the world knew. Mrs. Vance, Dr. Evans said, his voice becoming very clear and very careful. Your car is not just a car. It is, quite literally, a priceless national treasure. My breath hitched. National treasure, Dr. Evans continued. The museum has had a standing offer for that car, should it ever be found, for the last 20 years. Our official insured valuation, our standing offer to acquire the Ethereum, is $10 million. $10 million. The number just hung in the air of my small, quiet living room. It was an impossible sound. I couldn't speak. I just put a hand to my chest. Arthur's work. $10 million. And just as that impossible number settled, I heard another sound from outside. It was not a police car. It was not a quiet sedan. It was a loud, rattling car with a broken muffler, playing music I could hear through the closed windows. It pulled into my driveway fast. The younger officer turned his head toward the door. "That's him," I whispered. "That's Leo." A car door slammed outside, followed by another. The loud music cut off. I heard the familiar, heavy footsteps on the back porch, then the jingle of keys. He must have made a copy of my house key, too. The back door swung open and slammed against the wall. "Grandma, you in here?" Leo's voice boomed through the house. He walked through the kitchen and stopped dead in the archway of the living room. His eyes went from me to the two uniformed officers in my entryway, to Dr. Evans sitting in my armchair. He froze. His hand, reaching for his phone, just hung in the air. "What's this?" he said. His voice was instantly defensive. "What's going on?" He looked right at me, his eyes narrowing. "You called the cops on me?" "Seriously, Grandma?" He let out a short, ugly laugh. "Are you really that mad? Is this about that worthless car?" He took a step into the room, his arrogance flooding back. He was trying to take control. "I told you," he said, pointing a finger at me. "I got rid of it." "I did you a favor." The younger officer in the hall stepped forward, blocking his path. "Are you Leo Vance?" the officer asked, his voice low and firm. Leo scoffed. "Yeah, so what?" "Leo Vance," the officer said, his hand moving to the handcuffs on his belt. "You're under arrest for grand theft auto, transportation of stolen property, and theft of an asset valued in excess of $1 million. Silence. The word million hit Leo like a physical slap. His smirk vanished. His mouth opened slightly. His face went pale, then red. He looked from the officer to the very calm Dr. Evans, and finally, desperately, to me. "What?" he squeaked. "$1 million? What are you talking about?" "It was 500. It was a pile of junk." He pointed at me, his hand trembling. "She's crazy." "She's a crazy old woman. She's senile. She doesn't know what she's talking about." "Tell them, Grandma. Tell them it's worthless junk." I felt Dr. Evans's gaze on me. I felt the officer's attention. I pushed myself up from my chair. I stood leaning on my cane and took one step toward my grandson. The frail, forgetful old woman he saw was gone. My voice, when it came out, was not loud, but it was cold and it was clear, and it filled the entire room. "The car, as you called it," I said, "is a national treasure, Leo, and you stole it." That was all the officers needed. As if I had given the signal, the younger officer took Leo's arm. Leo tried to pull away. "Hey, get off me!" The officer was fast. He spun Leo around and pushed him against the wall, forcing his arms behind his back. I heard the sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs. Leo's arrogance completely shattered. It was replaced by a raw, childish panic. "No!" he yelled, twisting against the officer's grip. "Wait, you don't understand." "Grandma, you can't let them do this. It was a mistake." The officers didn't listen. They began to pull him toward the front door. "Grandma!" "Tell them, please." "I'll pay you back! I'll pay you the 500. "Grandma!" His voice was high and whining. The officers got him through the door and onto the porch. I heard the car door open. I stood in my living room, my hand tight on my cane. I watched them put my grandson in the back of the police car. I was alone in the quiet room with Dr. Evans. The only thing out of place was the crumpled $100 bill, still sitting right where Leo had thrown it. Months passed. The cold, quiet house was gone. The $100 bill on the coffee table was gone, taken as evidence. My life, it seemed, had been packed into boxes and moved. I was no longer in my small suburb. I was standing in a large, warm hall. The air was still and smelled faintly of floor polish. The only sound was the low, respectful murmur of voices. I was at the National Auto Museum. Dr. Evans stood beside me. He had been a constant, gentle presence for weeks. He had arranged for specialists to review Arthur's and my old notebooks, the ones Leo had called piles of paper. He had arranged for the loan, as he called it. He touched my elbow lightly. "Are you ready, Alara?" I wore a dark blue dress, one I had bought last week. It was not a wool coat. It was new, and it fit perfectly. "Yes," I said. He led me through an archway. The murmuring stopped, and then a wave of bright lights hit my face. Camera flashes. I blinked, and my hand went up to shield my eyes. And then I saw it. It was in the center of the room, on a raised, rotating platform. It was the Ethereum, but it was not the dusty, hidden thing from my garage. It was alive. The aluminum body was polished. It gleamed under the soft, focused spotlights, reflecting the light like water. It looked just as Arthur had intended, like it was moving. I walked toward it. The crowd parted. I heard the click, click, click of the cameras. I stopped at the red velvet rope. It was perfect. They had restored every part, every curve, every line. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "They did wonderful work," Dr. Evans said, his voice just for me. But the design was already perfect. They just cleaned the dust off. He pointed to a small, polished brass stand next to the platform. There was a plaque on it. It was not the small one from the dashboard. This was large, and the letters were clean and sharp. I stepped closer to read it. The Ethereum. Prototype 001, engineered by Arthur Vance. Designed by Alara Vance. My hand went to my mouth. I had not expected it. I looked at Dr. Evans. "Your notebooks, Alara," he said softly. "The design sketches. They were all in your hand. Your name was on the patents, right beside his. You were his partner, not just his wife. We had to make sure the world knew that." I looked back at the plaque. Alara Vance. I had been a wife. I had been a widow. I had been grandma. For the first time in 40 years, I was Alara again. A woman in a museum blazer handed me a large pair of gold scissors. I looked at the red ribbon stretched across the exhibit. I stepped forward. I put the scissors to the ribbon. The cameras flashed, but I did not blink. I made the cut. The snip of the scissors was loud in the quiet room. The ribbon fell away. The crowd began to applaud. It was a warm, polite sound. Later, after the speeches, after the handshakes, Dr. Evans found me. The hall was empty, cleared out for a private reception I had declined to attend. It was just me in the car. "The agreement is finalized," he said, standing a respectful distance away. "The financial arrangements for the loan, they are all complete. The trust is funded. You will never have to worry about money again." "Thank you, Dr. Evans," I said. "I was looking at the car. No, Alara, thank you. You and your husband. You gave us a piece of history." He was quiet for a moment. "I have one more thing," he said. "The police department is returning your personal effects from the case. The items from your living room." He handed me a large manila envelope. I did not need to open it. I could feel the stiff rectangle of paper inside. "They said it was technically yours, Dr. Evans said. I looked at the envelope, then back at the $10 million car. The car Leo had sold for $500, I held the envelope out. Dr. Evans, I said, does the museum accept small donations? He looked confused. Well, yes, of course, but please, I said, add this to the fund. It seems I have no use for it. He took the envelope. He understood. I stood there for a long time, just looking at my name, shining under the lights. My husband's legacy was safe. My name was known. I turned to leave the hall. I was secure. I was respected. But I knew this was not the end. The museum had vindicated my past. But there was one last thing to do. One last piece of my old life to settle. My lawyer was calling me in the morning, right before the hearing. Leo's sentencing? My house was different. It was the same walls, the same foundation, but it was no longer a place of dusty corners and sad memories. I had used some of the museum's initial payment. The walls were painted a warm, bright white. The old, sagging furniture was gone, replaced by a comfortable modern armchair and a small, sturdy table. The air smelled of fresh paint and new wood, not old oil. I sat in my new chair by the living room window, looking out at my own clean walkway. The cordless phone was cool against my ear. Yes, Mr. Hayes, I understand, I said. My lawyer, Mr. Hayes, had a dry professional voice. He was not cheap. I had hired him with the first deposit from the museum's trust. I hired him not for Leo, but for me. And the judge was not sympathetic, Mr. Hayes was saying. Given the evidence and his clear lack of remorse, the sentencing was straightforward. And the final verdict? I asked, though I already knew. Guilty on all counts, Mrs. Vance. Grand theft, transport of a high-value asset, all of it. He was sentenced this morning. I looked out the window. A blue jay landed on the bird feeder I had installed last week. Leo believed. He seemed to believe. You would step in, Mr. Hayes said, a note of careful curiosity in his voice. That you would stop the proceedings. Pay for his defense. I was told he called here. From the jail, I said. I did not answer. Yes. Well, a public defender can only do so much. He will serve a minimum of 2 years with a maximum of 5. 2 years. For $10 million, for his grandmother's heart. It seemed like a small number, but it was not my number. It was the court's. Thank you, Mr. Hayes, I said. You have been very helpful. Of course, Mrs. Vance. The trust is secure. Is there anything else I can do for you? No, I said. That will be all. Please send me the final bill. I pressed the off button and set the phone down on the table. The call was over. It was done. My daughter had called me once, screaming through the phone. She had called me a monster. She had called me ungrateful, for what I will never know. I had listened, and then I had hung up. I stood and walked into my new kitchen. I put a kettle on to boil for tea. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the hollow, empty quiet of before. It was a peaceful quiet. It was my quiet. I thought about the garage. The oil-stained concrete was still there, but the garage was empty. I had hired movers to clear out the rest of Arthur's tools. Not to sell, not for scrap. They were all sent to a local technical college, a donation in his name. My husband's legacy was safe in a museum, under bright lights, teaching a new generation. My name was on a plaque right next to his. I poured the hot water into my cup. I looked around my bright, clean, simple home. Leo's words from that day came back to me, the day he'd thrown the $100 bill on my table. I cleared out your junk for you. I took a sip of my tea. It was hot and it was perfect. He was right in the end. The junk was finally cleared out.